CALLA stands for Cognitive Academic Language Learning Approach. CALLA is the ESOL teaching method used in the K-12 system. It was developed in the 1980s by Anna Chamot and J. Michael O'Malley.
Before we discuss CALLA in particular, it's important to go over three important words: approach, method, and technique. An approach is a theory. Another synonym is model. A last synonym is research paradigm. An approach is an idea that needs to be tested. And the way we test the approaches to learning are by developing methods. A method is a list of procedures of precisely how to do something. That list is often referred to as a syllabus, an inventory of things the learner should master. This inventory is sometimes presented in a recommended sequence, and it's used to design courses and teaching materials. Now in my field, English as a second language, most methods include statements about how the language should be presented, about the sequencing and amount of focus on the various language skills, the descriptions of specific learning activities, and some methods provide their own second language acquisition theory, while others are aligned to a separate, already existing theory. Finally, on this list we have the word technique. A technique is a task. It's a classroom activity. Notice on the title of this slide I've used the greater than symbol. An approach is greater than a method, and a method is greater than a technique. The approach is the huge overall way of thinking about learning, what your belief system is on how learning happens. And inside of that gigantic idea of how learning happens, there are many methods that are related to the approach. And inside each one of those methods, there are many, many techniques, many, many classroom activities that go on. In this presentation, we will be examining in detail one particular method, and this method is called the Cognitive Academic Language Learning Approach, or CALLA. This method falls under the cognitive approach to learning a foreign language, and the three techniques that must be incorporated into a CALLA class are 1. Teaching students content information, 2. Teaching students relevant academic English skills, and 3. Teaching students learning strategies, which are sort of like study skills. Now, in the history of foreign language learning, my career field or discipline, there's a pendulum that swings back and forth, just like in politics, where the pendulum swings back and forth between right-wing conservatives and left-wing liberals. The pendulum in ESL swings back and forth between what we teachers should focus on when we teach foreign languages. We swing back and forth between accuracy and fluency. Accuracy means that the teacher expects the students to produce perfect language. The language they produce is perfect grammatically. The pronunciation is perfect. Everything is perfect. That's your accuracy. And there's nothing wrong with focusing on that. To the other extreme, there are teachers who focus only on fluency. Fluency is more like communication. Another way of looking at this is that accuracy is more like quality, and fluency is related to quantity. A teacher who values fluency just wants her ESL students to just produce language and not to worry about mistakes, just to try it out, take the risk, and say something. Now, cognitive approaches to foreign and second language learning developed in the late 20th century as a reaction to the behavioral approaches like audiolingual method, contrastive analysis, okay? Because the goal of perfection that the behavioral approaches aspired to was viewed as unrealistic. Students will make errors. A very famous and important second language acquisition researcher named Stephen Krashen tells us that errors are to be expected and used constructively in the learning process. This means that we move further away from perfection or accuracy and now focus more on communication or fluency in the cognitive approach. Another interesting characteristic of CALLA, besides its being a cognitive approach to language learning, is that it is a sheltered English method, which means that all students in the classroom are non-native speakers of English receiving instruction from a content teacher. You are being trained as a sheltered English teacher right now. You are a content teacher trained in ESL. You are a content teacher in this program specifically trained in CALLA. And you are learning to be sensitive to both the language needs of the students and the language demands of the content subject. And there are many activities in the classes that I teach bringing you closer and closer and closer to those two aspects of ESL teaching. You're learning about the proficiency levels that the students progress through. You're learning about various linguistic experiences that they have and difficulties that they have. But through the study guide document assignments, some of them focus on an authentic text that you're given, and you have to reflect on how you need to modify it so that an ELL can understand it. CALLA, in the same way, focuses on content rather than language, and that's what drives the curriculum. Now, a special acronym that is related to sheltered English is SDAIE, and you can see here on this slide it's written all in capital letters. It stands for Specially Designed Academic Instruction in English. And SDID strategies are used in most K-12 ESOL situations along with CALLA, where structured immersion is the norm. Structured immersion means that content delivery is in English, usually without support for L1 literacy. SDAIE provides support to ELLs rather than leaving them to sink or swim in a content class designed for native English speakers, just like CALLA gives them support. SDAIE combines second language acquisition principles with teaching modifications to make a lesson understandable to ELLs. SDAIE teachers not only address the content objectives of the discipline they teach, but they also support students' academic English by the use of visuals, hands-on props, manipulatives, cooperative learning, and so on. Now, what forces these teachers to think of these accommodations is a lesson plan template called SIOP. Again, written in all capital letters because it stands for Sheltered Instructional Observation Protocol. This lesson plan template was designed by an organization called CREED, in all caps CREDE, and that stands for the Center for Research on Education, Diversity, and Excellence. And the template that you'll be using for your critical assignment is a SIOP template. And if you look carefully through there, you can see there are quite a few accommodations for ESL, for ELLs. You are forced to think about on that template how you're going to prepare by listing your materials, but also more importantly things like vocabulary words that might be unique to ESL. This doesn't mean that you pick out the ones that are already in a glossary. what do you think your ELLs are going to have problems with? It forces you to think about your lesson delivery. What manipulatives should you bring in? Realia, visuals, props, and so on. It forces you to activate and build on the student's background. How are you going to provide your comprehensible input? How are you going to group the students to guarantee student interaction? These are all different accommodations that we need in ESL, providing ample practice. You already know English. There's no reason why you need to be practicing it. You need to say what you say and then use most of the class time for them to be talking or writing or reading or listening, whatever it is that you want them to practice. And then, of course, there is a segment there where they have to self-reflect and self-assess to review their knowledge and so on. So these accommodations are in there. When you start working for a public school district, you probably will not use this template at all, ever. Just like you probably will not use most of the templates that you see here in this program. The reason why you're using them here is because you're not working yet. You're still practicing and you're still learning. So these templates are forcing you to remember this stuff, to think about this stuff when you're dealing with ESL. And the hope is that eventually it will just become habit, that you're thinking about how to group, what vocabulary you need to go over. Did I bring in my visuals and manipulatives and props and so on? It's important to think about that with ESL. CALLA is content-centered language teaching. This is the integration of content learning with language teaching, or the concurrent study of language and subject matter. Most of the time, these two, content and language, are taught separately, in isolation. For example, your ELLs are pulled out of the classroom to go with the ESL teacher while you go on teaching math. By combining the two, content and language, learners become intrinsically motivated and empowered. Learners are focused on their own competence and autonomy as intelligent individuals capable of doing something with their new language. In CALLA, the content subjects are aligned with the all-English curriculum, so that practice is provided with a selection of actual topics students will encounter in grade-level classrooms. So, what do? What are your techniques? Well, you're going to teach content by activating schemata and by providing experiences in meaningful contexts. These words should be very familiar to you by now. We hear over and over again, activate schemata, provide meaningful experiences. These are best practices not only for ESL. What this boils down to is that ELLs and their parents want the same quality education as their native English-speaking peers. They don't want content to be diluted just because they're not yet proficient in their foreign language. As a matter of fact, they want it so badly that they filed a lawsuit against the state of Florida. And you've all learned about the Florida consent decree. Most schools that follow CALLA's specific recommendations introduce ELLs first to science because Chamot and O'Malley believe that the first content subject to be introduced should either have extensive contextual supports for learning or reduced language demands. The discovery and hands-on approach to science is compatible with providing ample contextual support for academic language development. Math is recommended to come after science because it has its own unique language, especially in solving word problems, but which nevertheless has fewer language demands than some of the other content areas. Social studies should be the third content area introduced, and language arts is actually recommended to be introduced last. In CALLA, you are not only a content area teacher, but you are also an English teacher. In a separate PowerPoint presentation, I go over in detail James Cummins. Remember here that in CALLA, of course, you are teaching CALP, not BICS. Remember that CALP involves more complex language and it includes literacy skills. Remember, too, that ELLs often take between 5 and 7 years and sometimes up to 10 years to catch up with their grade level peers in their use of academic language. Many teachers have noticed, like I mentioned before, that an ELL student speaks like an American child just after a year or two in the U.S. This observation may cause them to assume that the child no longer needs any special help in the classroom. However, many English language learners need years of ESL classes in order to close the language gap on academic tasks. Teachers also need to realize that knowing how to use language in one academic domain, like math, doesn't mean that the student can use it in other areas. Therefore, it's important for teachers to identify language concepts tied to the content area they teach. Using the CALLA methodology forces you to keep the responsibility of teaching the language functions in mind. The language modalities are the same as the language skills, and there are 4 of them: listening, reading, speaking, and writing. CALLA is not an English class. You are not teaching English, whether BICS or CALP, in order to accomplish the Sunshine State standards. Instead, you are primarily a science teacher, a social studies teacher, or a math teacher who happens to also include a little English teaching. But you only teach the English skills that are required to get the job done. Students learn how to use academic English to communicate subject matter concepts and processes. For example, you, the science teacher, say, "All right, everyone, your homework assignment is to write a lab report." Do you know how to do that? What is a lab report? What does it look like? What's included on a lab report? What's not included on a lab report? And then later on in the day, you, the social study teacher, says, "Okay, everyone, your homework is to write a research paper." Do you know how to do that? What is a research paper? What does it look like? What's in it? What's not in it? How is it different from a lab report? And then you teach how to write a lab report. You teach how to write a research paper. Content area teachers are not only expected to give guidance and instruction for written academic English, you are also expected to give guidance and instruction for spoken academic English. How to give a presentation, how to speak in front of an audience, so on and so forth. Learning strategy instruction is central to CALLA. So what is the definition of learning strategies? Learning strategies are ways to learn more efficiently and effectively. A learning strategy is like a trick we use to remember material or procedure. They're kind of like study skills. The basic premise is that students will learn academic language and content more effectively by using learning strategies. That is, students who use strategic approaches to learning will comprehend spoken and written language more effectively, learn new information with greater facility, and be able to retain and use their second language better than students who do not use learning strategies. Because this method is based on cognitive theory to learning, Chamot and O'Malley believe that students who are mentally active and who analyze and reflect on their learning activities will learn, retain, and be able to use new information more effectively. Research has found that successful learners, including students who are able to learn a foreign language, use learning strategies to help them really know the material. The good news is that strategies can be taught. Therefore, the goal of the learning strategy instruction is to help ELLs take a more active role in closing the language gap and mastering the course material. Now, if you do have your CALLA handbook from the ESOL Curriculum and Materials class, pages 62 and 63 list the 3 categories of learning strategies in Table 4.1. The 3 categories are metacognitive strategies, cognitive strategies, and social affective strategies. The metacognitive strategies are basically a list of strategies that help students to plan and monitor and evaluate their learning. The cognitive strategies are more in the intensive learning part, where they have to take notes, or they're classifying information somehow, or they're summarizing or using the material somehow. The social affective strategies are used like in cooperation or positive self-talk, and more of the affective filter strategies. You are receiving instruction on how to teach in a content area from some of the classes that you are taking here in the program. By taking the 5 TESOL courses, you are hopefully learning also how to teach language to ELLs. So I'm not going to go over what do you do in those 2 types of classrooms, but I will briefly go over how to teach a learning strategy, because this might be an area that is unfamiliar to you. First, what you need to do in your preparation to teach a class is that you need to use care in choosing a strategy. You have to find one that is most suited for the content material and the language task that you're going to be going over in class. Not all strategies can be used in all situations, in other words. And furthermore, not all strategies can be used by all students. So you have to ask yourself which strategy is appropriate for analyzing, for example, text organization or deriving meaning when you're reading a passage, which strategy is best for conducting and reporting on a science experiment, which strategy is helpful to solve a particular math problem, and so on. You're also going to consider students' learning styles. You probably have a mix of types, if not all types, represented in your classroom. So it's your job to present a variety of strategies and to tell the students why each one is the most effective for that particular task. Now, strategies are taught explicitly. You have to name the strategy. You have to say, class, today we are going to use a strategy called imagery. And then you're going to tell the students what the strategy does to assist learning. You're going to say, this helps you, imagery helps you because it helps you to think of a imaginary mental picture or a real picture to help you learn new information or to solve a problem. Then you need to model the strategy. You need to show them how it's used. And then, with different material, you're going to provide ample instructional supports. That means you're going to facilitate and provide feedback while the students practice and apply the strategy. Your objective as a teacher for the whole academic year is to provide students with a menu from which they will eventually select strategies on their own that they have found to be appropriate given certain activities and tasks. Remember what we said about learning styles. Your job is to present strategies for all learning styles in all situations, and this is how you create that menu I mentioned. Students need to be aware of their own learning styles and to choose from that menu which ones they want to use. As this happens, you're going to notice your role changing. The students will no longer be completely dependent on you. And I'll tell you what, I'll say this in a recording, I feel this is the key to the FCAT frenzy that goes on. If teachers throughout the year provide learning strategies to their students, it doesn't matter what the unknown material is on any test. if the students have been trained well in learning strategy instruction, they should be able to identify how to work through the material and answer questions correctly. My last objective in this mini lecture is to go over the PSYOP template so that you feel more comfortable in using it. But before we get there, we need to know what is the traditional way to plan an ESL lesson. When I was going to school, we learned that a lesson plan is divided into 3 parts: pre-learning, intensive learning, and post-learning. And we were taught to teach the skills separately. This was at the very beginning when integrated skills was becoming into vogue, and we were taught to do that as well. But the school where I was going to had a language learning institute where the students' classes were listening class, grammar class, reading class, so they were separated out. So what we would do is take out the word learning in these 3 parts and plug in the language modality. So if I was the listening teacher, in my lesson plan, I would have a pre-listening activity, I would have an intensive listening activity, and I would have a post-listening activity. Then students would move to reading class, and that teacher would have a pre-reading activity, an intensive reading activity, a post-reading activity. Then they would move on to the speaking class, and they would have a pre-speaking activity and an intensive speaking activity and a post-speaking activity, and so on and so forth through all of the language skills. The pre-learning part of your lesson plan is to activate schemata. Now, if I'm teaching an intensive listening class, then my pre-learning activity would be anything but listening. So I would have a reading activity for them to do to gear up for their listening. Or I would have them talk about something, so it would be a speaking activity. Or I would have them write about something. We have found that the language experience approach is very good to make sure that everyone has the same prior background knowledge. It sets the stage that everybody has had the experience and that they've had the same experience to build on, especially when cultures are different and you never know what someone may have experienced with something. Now, the pre-learning activity normally lasts about a quarter of the class time. So if you have an hour class, your pre-learning is going to be about 15 minutes. Then you move on to your intensive learning, and for my example, I'm the listening teacher, so now I'll have a listening activity, and I provide the new material that the kids are going to listen to. Maybe it's a radio program or a TV program or a movie or a mini lecture given by somebody else or myself, and after they listen to it, they need to answer questions on a worksheet, for example. And this normally lasts about half of the total class time. So again, if I'm teaching for 1 hour, I have a 15-minute pre-learning, then I have a 30-minute intensive learning, and then the last 15 minutes are spent on my post-learning or my post-listening, for example. And in this part, I could either have a debriefing period. This is especially helpful when you're doing, for example, a speaking activity that's kind of emotionally charged, like if you've just had a debate where the students really have true feelings about the topics that were being presented, or if they just listen to some kind of news broadcast, for example, the earthquakes in Haiti, that's particularly moving to them. You'd want to have a debriefing to have them come get their emotions brought back down. Another acceptable post-learning activity would be expanded practice. So if I'm doing an intensive listening, perhaps before the listening I did a reading activity, and then after the intensive listening I might have them write about something. For example, I would choose a totally different language modality so that in that course of an hour they're actually doing 3 modalities: reading and then listening for a long time and then writing for a short time. And again, this takes about a quarter of the total of class time. In CALLA lesson planning, the 3 basic steps, pre-learning, intensive learning, and post-learning, are brought out a little into 5 steps. Preparation is exactly the same as the traditional pre-learning. Preparation is where you are activating student schemata. Expansion at the end is exactly the same as the post-learning in the traditional lesson plan. You're going to have the students debrief, or you're going to have them use the information with a different language modality, or have them do another activity related to the same topic. The intensive learning section of the traditional ESL lesson plan in CALLA has been defined a little bit more precisely. What they did was break it down into 3 stages. So when you move from your preparation or your pre-learning into your intensive learning, first the teacher will present new material. Now, if this is a learning strategy instruction day, you're going to be teaching them about a learning strategy. If it's a content day, you're going to be teaching them about, George Washington or whoever. If this is an academic language learning day, then you will be teaching them about how to give a speech in front of the class. That's your presentation. Then, after you give them some instruction, they practice it. This is still part of that intensive learning section on the traditional plan. So you tell them, for example, how to give a speech, and then they give a mini speech, maybe to their small group or something. It's not the official one that you're grading. It's just a little practice one. And then they might give feedback to each other. This would be self-reflection or self-assessment. They can give feedback to each other, and then they have to reflect on how they did, how much they understood, whether they liked it or not. Or you can give them a form to fill out. This would be more called self-assessment rather than reflection. Reflection's more like journal writing. And then that's the end of your intensive learning, and you move into your expansion or your post-learning. So again, your preparation is going to be about a quarter of the time, expansion about the quarter of the time, and presentation, practice, self-reflection, all of that is going to happen half of your total class time. So it's a lot to cover. So your presentation as the teacher needs to be very concise and focused, because like I said, you already know social studies. You already know how to speak English. You already know how to study successfully. So there's no reason for you to be rambling on like I am in this presentation. Instead, you need to use most of the time to give to them to practice what you are talking about.